Morning. My name is Kaylee Nix. It's great to see all of you up here again. Today, day 0 of our Future of Freight Festival. I'll be your host and your MC for the next 3 days, so you'll see a whole lot of me. One more time, big round of applause for Spencer Frazier from JB Hines. And also a big thank you to JB Hunt, as they've been a great partner of the Future Freight Festival for several years now, and we are so excited to have them back here on the stage every single time they join us. I will be your bus driver, so I will keep us moving from place to place to place this week. Before we get things started, though, a couple of housekeeping items. We have a really, really great partnership going on this year, not just with our folks who you see in this room, but also with our amazing city of Chattanooga. So as Craig mentioned, please make sure that you get out and around Southside, visit some of our awesome businesses. They are so great. Everybody here is local. Pretty much nobody here is a chain restaurant. They really appreciate your business, so say thank you, be nice. They're awesome. The food is great. If you guys go to Stir, the lobster mac and cheese is something you absolutely have to eat. So go there, order it. It's great. Tell them Kaylee sent you. If you guys flip over your badge, make sure that you download the F3 app. It's going to be F3. It's in green, F3 2025. That's going to tell you everything you need to know throughout the next 3 days, your speakers, your agenda, where you need to be, when you need to be, what you can't miss, what you should see. All of that's going to be on the app and more. If you have any questions at all during this week, you can find me. I'll be in a blue dress. That's how you'll be able to identify me. We're going to go ahead and keep things moving. We've got our senior research analyst from FreightWaves joining us up here to talk a little bit about reindustrialization, an incredibly hot topic right now, especially as we see more investment in domestic manufacturing. So please give a warm welcome to JP Hampstead. He's also the host of our show, Bring It Home, which focuses on this topic. JP, take it away.
Thanks, Kaylee. Hello, everyone. Let's see if we can get that presentation pulled up. Awesome. I'm JP Hampstead, strategic analyst at FreightWaves. I've been working on supply chain data and freight markets at FreightWaves since 2017. But for the past year, I've been hosting a podcast called Bring It Home about reindustrialization. This was Greg Fuller's idea. He saw that there was really a gap in the media ecosystem about people talking about the manufacturing renaissance, the Trump administration and the Biden administration's efforts to rebuild the American industrial base. And so we started a show about it. 27 episodes later, I've interviewed miners, I've interviewed people from the energy industry, lots of manufacturers, policymakers, regulators, a couple of railroads, advocates for reindustrialization, economic development folks from people, from places like Memphis and Buffalo, and I've learned a lot about what's happening and what isn't. And that's kind of the impetus for this talk today, just to kind of share with you what I've learned. So I'm going to go through some just high level economic data, kind of characterizing the current state of the American industrial economy and how we got here, and then look at some reasons why things might be changing. All right, so this first slide is basically showing industrial production capacity and utilization. The red line is manufacturing separated out from industrial production. As you all know, industrial production includes things like mining, it includes utilities, it includes energy production. So manufacturing per se is just a part of that. One thing I really want you to see is that manufacturing production has not recovered from the great financial crisis. Total industrial production capacity has, the sort of the gray line up here is at record levels. Manufacturing capacity is not, and of course the actual production numbers are not. So that's kind of the state of where things are. You can see that essentially manufacturing production has been stagnant for over a decade. One of the engines of growth has been the energy industry. The United States is the largest oil producer in the world, the third largest petroleum exporter, the largest natural gas exporter. That trend really started in the Obama administration with President Obama's sort of all of the above energy strategy, where he actually did unlock a lot of oil and gas exploration and production. But that's one of the things that's been driving industrial production is energy. High tech industrial production grew faster than overall industrial production, really until recently. If you look in the 1990s, you can see that the red line, which is industrial production excluding high tech, grows much slower than total industrial production, which includes high tech. It's kind of an interesting effect. And part of it is obviously due to the personal computing revolution, the birth of the internet and things like that. We're also seeing, though, the 90s and the 2000s were really when America lost a lot of manufacturing jobs overseas, both due to the signing of NAFTA and then to China's entry into the World Trade Organization in the 2000s. And so that actually sort of sucked a lot of the lower end of manufacturing out, which is one of the reasons why high-tech industrial production grew faster than low-tech. This is manufacturing outputs. Again, a similar story. Really robust recovery from COVID, but not much has happened since then. And just diving into current GDP growth, people might have seen the headline GDP numbers, especially from Q2 of 3.8%, and said like, oh, the economy's doing amazing, 3.8% growth. We never saw that under Biden, et cetera. So this sort of breaks down what contributed to that GDP growth. On the left, you just see the real GDP numbers. That's sort of the total numbers. Then you see consumer spending positively contributed, investment, massive negative contribution, slight negative contribution on government spending, slight negative contribution on exports, and then a massive contribution on imports. Basically, what this just means is that part of the way that GDP is calculated is by subtracting imports from exports. And when imports cratered, it artificially pumped GDP. So it's sort of weird to say that the economy is growing faster now that we're importing less stuff. But because of the way the math works, it created a really high GDP number. So again, don't be fooled by these sort of one-dimensional headline composite numbers. You really have to dig into the data to understand what's happening. And yeah. All right. Finance and tech mostly drive GDP growth. So the orange lines or the yellow lines are services. The blue lines are goods. Non-durable goods manufacturing contributed 65 basis points to GDP growth in the second quarter, and durable goods manufacturing contributed 46 basis points to GDP growth in the second quarter. Both of those were smaller than either information or finance and insurance, and then professional and technical services also kind of rounded that out. So it's not nothing, but it's also not driving the economy right now. One of the questions you may be asking is, okay, well, if manufacturing isn't actually doing anything, if it's relatively stagnant right now, why are we hearing so much about reindustrialization in the news? Why is Trump making such a big deal about it? What's with all of these headlines coming out of the White House? And I went through and rounded up sort of all of the manufacturing investment headlines that have been announced in conjunction with the Trump administration, kind of added them up by industry vertical and things like that. Pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, one of the leaders. The biggest one, if you look down just a little bit, is technology and data centers at $776 billion that have been pledged or announced. That's a really interesting one because unlike most other booms in the American tech sector, artificial intelligence is sort of, implies like a massive infrastructure build out. It's kind of it really is a sort of, it puts the industry back in tech industry in a way. It requires the manufacture of all of these chips, the build out of data centers, the consumption of large amounts of power and water and people and things like that. So AI and semiconductors were the two largest categories. Pharmaceuticals, another large one. Automotive, energy, appliances, sort of rounding that out. Again, I would encourage you to dig deeper into these announcements, especially when you see the big splashy numbers coming from White House press releases. Many of these commitments are multi-year commitments. Many of them are only incremental increases to CapEx that was already planned, right? And some of them are just sort of, aren't necessarily what we would think of as like direct investments in manufacturing, but are sort of investments in vendors and suppliers and things like that. And just as an example, Apple announced they've increased this number, but several times, but I think they've ended up with a $600 billion investment announcement in the US over the next 5 years. When you break down what that actually means, a lot of it, they talk about spending lots of money with various vendors. One of them, as an example, Corning Glass in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. I'm sure everyone knows what Corning Glass is. Apple has said that going forward, all of the iPhones and Apple Watches sold in the world globally will use glass made from Corning Glass in Kentucky. That plant is announcing like a $2.5 billion expansion, which is they're, I think, increasing their workforce by 50% there. It's a massive project, but those are the kinds of numbers that sort of get rolled up into Apple's like $600 billion number. So it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily true that, $600 billion will be plowed into Apple facilities. This reflects like sort of industrial spending with their supply chain in the US. All right. Manufacturing employment growth has paused. This is sort of a really long-term good chart to kind of study and internalize if you want to know like the history of the United States. You can see where manufacturing employment peaked in the late 1970s. You can see the sort of drastic, plummet with the entry of China into the World Trade Organization in the year 2000, and just before that, another dip, another sort of dip during the Great Financial Crisis that we never truly recovered from, thanks to a very active policy response during the COVID pandemic that had many, many knock-on effects. The onrush of capacity into the trucking industry being one of them. But thanks to that policy response, we did recover from the COVID pandemic really well. And actually, we can zoom in on this a little bit, and exceeded pre-pandemic manufacturing employment levels. But that effect had faded by the time of the 2024 election, and now we're back below that. And there's a broader story to be told about manufacturing employee productivity and how many people we actually need to build things, which I'll get to in a minute. But just know that manufacturing employment is actually still shrinking. So accompanying the decline of employment has been steady growth in productivity. And I want to kind of call out an interesting example of this. Early in the 20th century, the largest automotive manufacturing plant in the United States was the Ford River Rouge plant in Dearborn. It produced the Model A starting in 1928. It employed about 100,000 people and produced approximately 300,000 vehicles per year. Its capacity was. The actual output sort of varied with the Great Depression, but about 100,000 people, 300,000 vehicles per year, or 3 vehicles per employee per year. Does anyone know what the largest automotive plant in the US is today by number of employees? Craig, guess? Well, for automotive assembly, so for the Ford plant, like the blue oval stuff includes a lot of like battery. It may well be, but the current automotive plant in the United States with the highest number of employees is Toyota in Georgetown, Kentucky, which has about 9,300 employees. It produces anywhere between 435,000 and 550,000 vehicles a year, or approximately 50 vehicles per employee per year, which essentially means that in the last 100 years, we've seen a 16.5x productivity gain among automotive assembly employees, right? They're producing 16 and a half times cars per employee per worker. That's so any kind of reindustrialization that the United States experiences may be decoupled from total manufacturing employment. And that's, I think there's different ways of looking at that number. You could say like, it's great that American workers are so productive now, but it's also bad that, if we increase our industrial production, it won't actually impact American workers and families that much. It won't create as many jobs. One of the sort of positive aspects of this is that you no longer need to locate large manufacturing facilities in major metropolitan regions. You don't have to put a big automotive plant in Detroit. You don't have to put a large, computer factory in Los Angeles. There are smaller communities in the U.S. that can furnish those employees. And although 9,300 automotive assembly workers isn't a huge number compared to the massive industrial barracks that we saw in the early 20th century, it's still a very significant number to a community like Georgetown, Kentucky, which is sort of, north of Lexington, kind of in the middle of nowhere. No offense. All right. And actually, productivity growth since COVID has been faster for American workers. And this is another multifaceted number to look at. It's fascinating to think of the reasons why recessions actually accelerate worker productivity. Part of it, it could be that when the economy is struggling and businesses are laying off workers, that they tend to reduce the least productive workers out of the, they tend to churn out the least productive workers. And so the average productivity goes up. It could just be that with similar amounts of work to be done and fewer people, the workers are simply forced to do more. But it's interesting because the fact that worker productivity always increases sort of in the back half of recessions just indicates that there's a fair amount of slack in this sort of, even as productive as American workers are, it seems like, there's a wide range of productivity inside of organizations, and that most people can do more, and also that technology has been a sort of a continual force increasing productivity. And I think that productivity growth can reaccelerate. So this is the average annual growth in productivity by decade. You can see that in the 90s and 2000s, those 2 decades where we saw sort of the largest drop in the number of manufacturing employees total, also saw some of the fastest accelerations in productivity. Again, likely because the sort of the least productive or the least value added manufacturing was precisely the sectors that were being sucked out of America and being offshored. Average annual manufacturing wage growth has nearly doubled to 5.5% since the pandemic. This is really interesting. Again, if we were talking about the 1990s or the 2000s, I think it would be mostly attributable to just the disappearance of low-end manufacturing. But I think this also has, since we're talking about the post-pandemic period, I think it has more to do with labor shortages and just the need to find better, higher quality, higher skilled talent. manufacturing is increasingly energy efficient. And we'll talk about this in a minute because America's energy grid is coming under more and more strain. Brownouts and blackouts are more common. But basically, you can just see the green chart is manufacturing gross output. The gray bar chart is manufacturing energy consumption. And they're basically like decoupled. One was, estimated manufacturing energy intensity decreased by 52%, while gross output increased by 81% from 1998 to 2022. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And I think it just goes along with the long-term trend of just a less energy intense and less emission intense American economy. For all of those who are sort of involved in like net zero, green initiatives, things like that, people concerned about climate change, and who feel guilty about all of the CO2 they're putting in the atmosphere, you can rest easy and know that CO2 emissions per capita in the United States have been steadily declining for the past 50 years, in fact, since the 1970s and the OPEC crisis of 1973. Petroleum and petrochemical refining drives energy consumption in manufacturing. It's by far sort of the most energy intensive processes. And you can see heavily the brown chemicals part heavily concentrated in the South and particularly the Gulf Coast. So how do we get industrial production unstuck? Really three big ideas here. One is more energy, cheaper energy, abundant, reliable energy. The second is regulatory streamlining and tax incentives for manufacturing. And third is workforce development. What's interesting about this is that, I love our president. I think one of his great talents is sort of face-to-face, deal-making, one-on-one negotiations, the art of the deal, et cetera. But that doesn't always translate into the most sort of predictable, certain policy frameworks for capital allocators to make decisions based on. But ironically, I do think that since the Biden administration, the federal government has been putting together these three pieces slowly but surely, and we're going to dig into that in a second. So one of the reasons why more energy is so urgent is that basically incremental U.S. energy production will increasingly be consumed by AI. The current rate at which we're adding power to the grid is not enough to meet the projected demands simply from AI, which means that we're sort of like, if we don't start adding energy production faster, we're already in a hole, meaning the energy prices will go up. So that's kind of one of the exigencies of building more energy. So one of the strategies that the U.S. is pursuing, there's been less of an emphasis on renewables like wind and solar, and more of an emphasis on nuclear power, which produces a large volume of reliable energy and is probably best suited for sort of the supporting an industrial base. There's been a lot of policy movement on that this year. Multiple executive orders, announcements by Westinghouse about building another 10 AP1000 reactors by 2030. Lots of interesting partnerships where Microsoft is getting involved in restarting 3 Mile Island. Google is partnering with Kairos to build a small modular reactor in the TVA network to offset its power demands from a data center. So, and then I just want to call out that Morgan Stanley raised its projection of investments in nuclear power by 40% through 2050. So the tide is turning, and what may have been a kind of a sort of a luxury environmentalist belief that nuclear was bad and that we need to shut down nuclear because of the dangers of nuclear waste, I think is succumbing to the reality that we simply need more power any way that we can get it. And as bad as nuclear waste is, it doesn't automatically go into the atmosphere like waste from coal and natural gas. All right. And then the International Atomic Energy Agency has also raised projections for world nuclear electrical generating capacity. The dot is sort of 2024, 2025 is where we are now. You can see there's sort of fairly confident about what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and then just massive uncertainty about how these investments are going to play out and the sort of the global appetite for actually building these plants. And so basically just including this chart to show that the future isn't determined, that there's still a lot of advocacy work to be done to make the future happen. And then getting to the second part of what we can do to get industrial production unstuck, going to bonus depreciation for manufacturing, just tax incentives. This is really powerful. It's something that the Trump administration is building on from his first term. But basically, it just means that 100% of the value of new manufacturing facilities can be depreciated in the first year, which takes a lot of money off of like corporate tax bills and just makes it easier to pull the trigger on those investments. There's studies kind of demonstrating that it should raise equipment investment by around 10 to 17% and boost GDP by 60 basis points long term. So that's happening, and recent workforce development initiatives have really been kicking into gear since the Biden administration. If you remember the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, sort of hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars of spending by the government in conjunction with the private sector. The Biden administration recognized at the time that the United States didn't necessarily have the workers to support all those investments. And so they created various challenges and they're funding training, but they're also sort of doing corporate pledges. And there's a number of those things that have happened. They've also invested in workforce hubs. We haven't seen it as much on workforce development from the Trump administration as the Biden administration. I think that things are in the works, but nothing huge has been announced yet. So that's still sort of a question mark, I think. And then lastly, just some takeaways. American manufacturing workers are fewer but more productive, higher paid, and more energy efficient. Investment in certain strategic areas is accelerating. Trade policy and tariffs are really only part of the solution. Simply slapping a tariff on a country does not necessarily make the United States the best destination for that facility, whether it's a component, a supplier, natural resource extraction, or assembly and finished goods. And so the tariffs really have to be part of like a whole suite of policies to really boost reindustrialization. And then there are still critical bottlenecks in upstream supply chains, like minerals, metals, fabrication. One example is basically how China controls the refining of certain metals. For certain metals, they have upwards of 80 to 90% of the refining capacity in that country, which means that they can effectively control the price of that metal and sort of artificially lower it to prevent American companies from even starting to exploit the resources we have in our own borders because it's not economically viable. And so, there are people working on ways that the government can help finance sort of alongside with customer commitments to kind of bridge that gap and help those miners and metal refiners kind of get started and re-enter the market and take back share. Again, this is an example of another sort of upstream problem that remains to be solved. But thank you very much. I'm out of time. People are waiting to speak. I really appreciate it. Have a great supply chain day and F3.